Welcome to the International Research Training Group IRTG Diversity podcast on temporalities of diversity. My name is Giti Hatef Rasa and I'm a doctoral researcher within the IRTG. I'm in my 40s, I've got salt and pepperish hair up to my chin. I'm wearing a black shirt and I'm sitting at my desk in my study. In the background there's a bookshelf and a red cupboard and a guitar. Our guest is Professor Robert McRuer from the English department of the George Washington University. He's known as one of the founding scholars involved in forming the field of queer disabilities, and particularly for the theoretical perspective on Crip theory. Welcome, Robert.
Thank you. I'm happy to be here.
Would you briefly describe yourself and where you are?
I am sitting at home, as most people are around the world, and I am in a medium lit room with books behind me on a white sofa. I'm a white man in my mid-50s and have a green polo shirt on and a bit of a beard.
Thank you. The title of your recent book is Crip Times, Disability, Globalization and Resistance. The times element in your title suggests that the construct of temporality is relevant to your research. And in this podcast, as I said before, we decided to focus on temporalities of diversity. So I would like to ask you to reflect on the concepts of temporalities, diversity, and Crip from the perspective of your research field.
Sure, I'd be happy to. I tended to use the term Crip Times in a really multivalent way in the study. The book looks at a global austerity politics and puts forward the idea that disability is a sort of under-theorized but absolutely central component of that global politics. The book is centered on the UK, but spins out to Spain and Greece and the United States and Latin America. And the times of the title are at least doubled, whereby on the one hand, looking at the age of austerity, the age of neoliberalism in particular, Crip times are virtually Victorian dark times. They are bad times for the vast majority of people who are suffering beneath them because of cuts to public services, because of all the other effects of austerity, raising the retirement age, privatizing more and more education, healthcare services, and so forth. All of that ensures that Crip Times has that sort of negative valence, but I wanted it to also tap into a different sort of future-oriented temporality, whereby Crip Times represents the inventive, engaging, generative ways that disabled artists, activists, and theorists around the globe have resisted austerity and resisted these bleak, hard, challenging times. That said, I think we can add even more layers to what temporality means within Crip times. I think neoliberalism in generally is always forward-looking. My colleague Katarzyna Kolorowa in the Czech Republic writes about how the post-socialist period was explicitly characterized by a capitalist temporality that put the past behind us and saw the future as the cure after a century of socialism. And her argument is that capitalist temporality means that various Crip experiences and Crip lives are invisibilized. And so she looks in her work to the ways in which Crip bodies and lives and experiences in the socialist period actually generated various kinds of knowledges that are in danger of being forgotten if we're on that straight line, forward-looking temporality. So I think my work is part of larger work in both queer temporalities and Crip temporalities. We often talk about Crip time in disability communities, and that is meant as a kind of endearing in-group reference to slowness.
Mm-hmm.
So if something's happening on Crip time, it means like, okay, don't count on it starting at exactly the top of the hour. Don't count on it finishing. Make sure there's plenty of time for mobility issues or for translation issues, if we're talking about sign language or other modalities, for interruptions that might come from health-related issues and so forth. So Crip time is generally this kind of endearing in-group phrase that talks about slowness. But it's also been theorized in really stretchy ways by others in both positive and negative ways. So for Helen Samuels, in her widely circulated essay, 6 Ways of Thinking About Crip Time, she talks about how Crip time is often painful time and sick time and isolated time, uh, even if it also might be, she ends with this notion that it also might be writing time. And there are a range of theorists who are thinking about, well, you know, I'm sick, but I'm writing a lot. Lots of people are sick and not writing a lot, but I'm thinking particularly of Leah Lakshmi Pepina Samarajina's book Care Work, where she talks about how being sick often does generate time for writing. And so Crip time sometimes is writing time as well. But all of these temporalities are very uneven, you'll note, in contrast to that straight line of productive capitalist movement towards the future.
You visualized on your book cover an artist, a work of art in the background, the figures. So you showed something that took a lot of time. And that is could you describe why you decided for this background and a little bit about the artist who is involved in this work?
The artist's name is Liz Crow. She is a disability artist based in Bristol in the UK. She's done a number of amazing installations, including one called Bedding Out, that's very much about temporality, where she performed in a public space in her bed and invited people to tweet and engage as a way of kind of making visible what is often not so visible when disability is in the house or what have you. And so she's done a range of other things, including stuff connected to the T4 program in Germany. There is this place in London in Trafalgar Square where there are 4 plinths, but the 4th plinth is reserved for artists. And there was one period where in a 24-hour period, I think 24 different artists were there, and she performed in her wheelchair in a Nazi uniform to draw attention to the dangers of the forgotten history of those who were killed during that period. The piece in question was called Figures and was an idea that she had to draw attention to lives impacted by austerity in the UK particularly, though the project ultimately became more global. Initially, she was thinking, oh, I want to do something that represents all the lives lost to austerity, but for many reasons that became challenging. How does one quantify that? You know, lives lost to suicide, okay, infant mortality, someone dying early for not having adequate care. There's many things that could be, but it's hard to tell. And also, ultimately, Liz wanted to put together an installation that looked at the suffering that resulted in death and the suffering that is ongoing for those who are alive. So what she did was a performance piece, and she excavated raw river mud from the banks of the River Avon near Bristol, and transported that mud to the banks of the Thames in London for, I think, a 12-day period in April 2015, if I have the date right, March and April, I think. And at low tide, so roughly an hour at sunrise and sunset, she would sit on the banks of the Thames and sculpt figures, sort of abstract figures, but figures that suggest humans, but not necessarily particularized humans. You could see eyes and a nose and a sort of neck, but they were still rather abstract. she's a wheelchair user and would be carried to the site on the Thames because it's not accessible each time that she would sculpt. And as she sculpted, her team, her artistic team, was up on the walk talking to people. And I was sometimes part of that artistic team for a few days, talking about what austerity was doing to people in the UK and elsewhere. And those conversations were very varied. Some people would say, oh, she's wasting her time. Others would be involved in the politics of a particular location in the UK. Others were making connections to Spain. And often various people would descend the ladder to go talk to her directly. As she sculpted, there was an installation where each figure represented someone's story. So someone who ended his life because he felt that there were no more resources to care for him in the family. Someone who ended up living out of a food bank because of missing an appointment. There's very punitive requirements in the UK. If you miss a benefits appointment, you're sanctioned and you can't come back for another month. And so people ended up living from food banks. The stories involved transportation, education, and so forth. So eventually she had one sculpture for every constituency in the UK. It was a beautiful and massive performance piece that they then traveled around the UK with, the southern part of the UK. Eventually, these were all carried back to Bristol, and in a final performance, almost final performance, she had the pieces ground into dust in a bonfire while all of the stories were read aloud. And then the absolutely final piece was the ashes of the sculptures were scattered into the sea to represent solidarity with people fighting austerity in Chile and Spain and Greece and the US and other locations. So it was a piece that captured, again, that alternative temporality. How are people actually getting by under very dire circumstances, and what kinds of forms of solidarity are forged in and through those challenging circumstances?
So, and a snapshot of this performance, of the outcome of this performance, is the background of your book. That's really great.
The cover of the book shows the place where, as the pieces accumulated, they were increasingly displayed.
In what ways is diversity a temporal construct?
That's a very abstract question, but I certainly can talk to it. I think in a really basic way, we might say that what the philosopher Michel Foucault called subjugated knowledges interrupted what we might think of as canonical knowledges, history with a capital H, as it may be. And so movements connected to diversity for the past 50 years have insisted, wait a second, your history with a capital H is writing us out. And so those were temporal interruptions, and interruptions that also drew attention to sort of whole alternative temporal universes inhabited by subjugated peoples, subjugated knowledges. So I think diversity is a temporal concept through that notion of interruption. I'd also say diversity is a temporal construct through its opening up of alternative futurities. So many people now cite the late queer theorist Jose Esteban Munoz, who wrote a book called Cruising Utopia, where he looked at basically how queer time is always not quite here. To be queer is to be not yet, not here, not now. And many thinkers in disability studies and Crip culture have found that really useful for thinking about disability in particular, because disability is often understood in the dominant ableist imagination as that which is without a future, has no future, or what we want to avoid in the future. So an ableist imagination would kind of genocidally imagine a world without disability in it. And so that notion of cruising utopia and alternative futures is the other thing that I think sort of diversity as a temporal construct bequeaths us.
How is Crip related to the concept of diversity? For example, do you think that the media have responded to the UN Convention on Rights for Persons with Disability, which went in force more than a decade ago, by newer forms of representation and more participation?
Mm-hmm. Crip is related to diversity in kind of contestatory ways. I mean, I think a certain notion of diversity can be easily commodified and capitalized upon. And we've seen that perhaps most pronouncedly in the queer movement, where, you know, queer remains, I think, an often resistant, defiant concept, but it also, over the past 30 years, has become a market. And you get queer pride brought to you by Absolute Vodka and things like that. So I think diversity, as it is contained or domesticated by neoliberal capitalism, puts things into neat categories that it can then market to or use as kind of a representative of how benevolent it is. So the UK is a great example of that. The London 2012 Paralympic Games were offered up, the most watched Paralympic Games in history. They were offered up as a kind of celebration of diversity. And even by the very conservative government that was implementing austerity at the time, at the exact moment that Paralympians were being broadcast to the world, disabled activists were outside the stadium protesting the government's policy and how it was devastating the lives of disabled people. So the point in that example is that diversity was being weaponized to serve as, to mix metaphors, to serve as a kind of smoke screen to obscure what was actually happening on the ground for disabled lives. In that sense, diversity can be quite problematic, but I think we're constantly reinventing it as well. And I think that's what Crip and Queer at its best also do. So Crip is definitely an I statement. People do insist, I am Crip, I am part of Crip culture, I live a Crip life, I live in Crip time, all of these things. It's a substantive, defiant, excessive, flamboyant identity. It's also a nice term for talking about what doesn't fit neatly into categories. So Crip is about that which gets left out, which gets invisibilized, which doesn't get to qualify for a placement at the diversity ball. So it's a nice, stretchy, generatively paradoxical concept in relation to diversity.
And jumping into the present, the pandemic, do you think that the Black Lives Matter movement is also some kind of creating a smoky screen for Crip and disability movements? Is this more stronger and now covering up the other movements, or is it something where everything comes together and one movement supports the other?
I hope the latter, and I can absolutely affirm that disability artists and activists and theorists stand with Black Lives Matter. In fact, Leroy Moore and others have shown that a high number of people who are victims of anti-Black police violence are actually also disabled. You hear it in the very watchword from George Floyd, I can't breathe. It's certainly true that he couldn't breathe because he had a knee upon his neck, but he also had various pre-existing conditions that would mark him as disabled or Crip, and that's not the only high-profile case where that is true.
So that's intersectionality also.
Right, and I
Yeah.
think it's really vital to say their names and to stress that we are in a incredibly dangerous moment where Black lives need to be absolutely centered, and the centrality of anti-Blackness to this violence needs to be constantly spoken. That said, often, again, the victims of that violence are disabled as well, and it seems that that violence sometimes is invisibilized, and it only serves all movements better to stress, look, this is anti-disabled as well as anti-Black. And also, as Anna Malo has written, it's also often anti-fat. So the fat rights movement has talked about fatness as an identity, and it's interesting to look at certain instances of police violences and the ways in which body size is mobilized as an excuse. Oh, Eric Gardner was 300 pounds, and so of course he couldn't breathe. As though that somehow justified the violence that was meted out upon him. So I actually think that disability and Crip activists are really tied into the Black Lives Matter movement and fully behind it in ways that are quite exciting. And hopefully that intersectionality, as you say, will only grow, especially if we can end the current global nightmare that we are in, especially in the United States.
Yeah, a couple of days to go.
A couple of days to go.
Coming to the end of our interview, I would like to invite you to meditate or to speculate on the future of cripping, crip as a verb. In your opinion, what are the most prominent potentials and issues in this context?
What I love about cripping as a verb, which it's important to stress that behind crip as a verb is already, it functions as a noun. It functions as an adjective to modify culture or humor or film. But as a verb, I love the fact that it is still being invented by disability communities. Like, what do we mean when we're talking about to crip? Carrie Sendall was the one to first theorize what cripping might be, and she's noted in the past how people forget how much she tied it to humor. So cripping for her was often about the ways that disabled performers in particular undo ableism through biting, sarcasm, and wit, and satire. So to crip for her was to expose sort of the arbitrariness of what's normal and what's abnormal, but to often do it with this kind of flair, this comedic flair. I think to crip also often gets at what is made invisible in relation to a topic where disability should be absolutely central. So, you know, in the world that I move in, it's like we talk about disability and neoliberalism all the time. And it's like, of course we would. It seems so natural. I think this is true for queer theorists of neoliberalism as well. But, you know, the big boys of neoliberal theory are not talking about disability. They're not actually talking about queerness either. That's a sort of side issue. And neoliberalism is this sort of big economic issue that is problematic and needs to be critiqued, but disability is not part of their agenda. So to counter that, in Prague in 2010 and 2013, there was a conference, first one called Cripping Neoliberalism, and then a couple years later, Cripping Development. So putting these concepts, neoliberalism, development, on the table, concepts that aren't marked as disabled on the surface, but to crip them means to say, well, actually, disability is totally central to our conversations and needs to be brought to the position from which it was kind of banished. So to crip in that sense is to make visible what was actively invisibilized. I think to crip also often relies on just a sort of basic pointing the finger at an access gap. So like someone saying, I want to crip this. It's like saying, look, my body doesn't fit in the space. Look, I can't understand what's happening here because it's not captioned. Look, I need this to be repeated because my mind functions in a particular way. So to crip can also be about just pointing out where access needs to be made more visible. I love the ways in which Amy Hamrai, who is a theorist of built culture, the built environment, she talks about sort of crip technoscience along with her colleague, or I should say they, Hamrai uses they, them pronouns. They talk about crip technoscience along with their colleague, Kelly Fritsch, who and they've written a Crip Technoscience manifesto, but Hamrai's contribution that I find so wonderful is a distinction between neoliberal curb cuts and Crip curb cuts. So neoliberal curb cuts are curb cuts that make everything function so smoothly that disability disappears. If there's a curb cut, oh, okay, wheelchair user can use that. We don't have to think about disability anymore. But for Hamrai, a Crip curb cut messes things up and makes it impossible to, and it's kind of an abstract concept, but they mean it to talk about how curb cuts are constantly needed to interrupt a conversation, talk about what's lacking, and so forth.
So everybody can crip?
I think so. I mean, I think just as we know that feminism is an analytic that can be carried to any situation, even if it doesn't appear to be about gender on the surface. So it's very possible to talk about a feminist reading of anything. In that sense, it's possible to talk about a queer reading, a Crip reading, about anything. I do think it's important for able-bodied people in particular to be aware of when and where to use cripping in a non-appropriative way. If someone is using to crip in that verb sense that was the second to last one that I gave you, pointing out access, you know, that does seem to be a more sort of disability specific use of to crip. Like, I need access to this room. I'm going to crip this situation. But I think many critical thinkers and activists and artists can crip whether they're able-bodied or not, if in fact we return to that notion of making visible the invisibilized centrality of disability to a given issue or location.
So to more cripping.
More cripping.
More cripping.
Yes, more cripping. I like that because it sort of like echoes the famous Jewish sense of more life, and more life, more cripping, l'chaim is what we might say.
That's a perfect ending and last sentence for our podcast. I thank you very much on behalf of the IRTG, and I'm looking forward to your next work. What are you working on at the moment?
A bibliography on Crip theory that will be a research bibliography. But beyond that, I'm germinating slowly a project on disability justice in Latin America. I spent most of the lockdown in Colombia. I'm back in the US now, but I'm thinking about disability justice crossing borders in Latin America specifically.
So this is a project for 2021, for next year?
And beyond.
And then, okay. So thank you very much.
All right, thank you. It's been a pleasure.
For me too.